Chapter 1. Daisy awoke as the first rays of dawn began to filter through the silken curtains of her cozy tree hollow home, tucked away in the heart of the fairy forest realm. She slowly opened her sapphire blue eyes, blinking away the last remnants of sleep. Daisy stretched her lithe arms up towards the carved acorn shell ceiling and fluttered her gossamer wings, still stiff from slumber. Rising from her petal-soft bed, Daisy gently plucked her leaf-green blanket woven from the finest spider silk and folded it neatly. She buzzed over to her trickling fountain washed in the golden light of sunrise and splashed the fresh forest water on her face, to finish waking herself up. Daisy looked around her house, taking in the lovely details she had added over her 16 years living there. The walls were painted with glowing moss and adorned with strings of tiny pearls collected from meadow flowers. Her bookshelf was carved into the trunk itself and filled with leather-bound books recounting fairy tales and legends, written in inks of rose petal and blackberry. Daisy's eyes rested on a portrait depicting her as a young child with her parents. Their warm smiles radiated love, and Daisy felt comforted being in her childhood home once more. Her parents had built this tree hollow for her before they were called away to serve in the Fairy Queen's court. Gliding over to her acorn vanity table, Daisy picked up her hairbrush crafted from smooth willow wood with bristles of the finest spider silk. She gently brushed through her long, wavy locks the color of golden honey, untangling any knots acquired in the night. Daisy then opened the maple leaf cabinet of her vanity and chose her outfit for the day. She selected a shimmering mint green dress woven from the most delicate strands of grass. Tiny azure cornflowers were embroidered around the hem, which Daisy knew would complement her sapphire eyes perfectly. She dressed quickly and tidied her appearance. Checking herself in the foxglove flower mirror, Daisy carefully arranged her hair just so and made sure the pixie dust freckles on her rosy cheeks sparkled. She gave a nod of satisfaction before turning and floating over to her kitchen to prepare breakfast. Daisy had stocked her pantry well, filling it with all manner of delectable fairy delicacies. There were jars of honey in creamy golden hues, pots of fragrant clover nectar, sacks of ground cinnamon from tree bark to sprinkle on top of acorn porridge. Daisy decided to start her day by plucking a plump, juicy berry from the vine that curled around her cupboards. She bit into the ruby-red berry, its sweet juices bursting in her mouth, perfectly ripened by the springtime sun. After enjoying the berry down to its last seed, Daisy grabbed an acorn top and dipped it into a jar of fresh morning dew collected from the leaves outside. She sipped the refreshing drink as she glanced out her open window at the lovely forest scenery. Daisy could already hear the sounds of the woods coming to life in the glow of morning. Butterflies began to take flight, their kaleidoscopic wings beating a steady rhythm. Birds emerged from their nests and started their joyful songs to dawn's light. Squirrels foraged for their breakfast, nimble and quick. After eating her fill of berries and dewdrops, Daisy ventured outside into the crisp, fresh air of the fairy forest. She hovered above the neighborhood of mushroom cottages and moss-covered homes, greeting her fellow fairies as they too arose to start their day. Daisy flew effortlessly over and around enormous oak trees, centuries old with trunks as big as castles. Weaving between the trees, Daisy waved to friends and neighbors, admiring their brightly colored wings catching the slanted beams of light filtering down through the lush green canopy above. Though all fairies possessed translucent wings that shone like stained glass, each was unique in size, shape and hue. Daisy thought her sapphire wings were the loveliest in all the land. Past the village Daisy flew, feeling carefree and alive. She danced and twirled through the sun-splashed meadows bursting with life. Vibrant wildflowers carpeted the forest floor in every color, bright crimson poppies, sunny yellow buttercups, bold purple foxgloves. Daisy trailed her fingers through the cool grass as she flew effortlessly over verdant hills and around rocky streams. At last Daisy came upon her favorite spot, a tranquil mossy clearing at the edge of the woods. Here she had spent countless hours gazing out past the sheltering trees towards the rolling green hills that stretched on to meet the horizon. Floating down into a bed of violets, Daisy lay amongst the fragrant flowers and watched the wispy clouds drift lazily across the azure sky. Though she cherished her idyllic life amongst the creatures and fairies of the forest realm, Daisy felt a yearning tug inside her heart to explore the world beyond. Out there, somewhere past the canopy of leaves, adventures were waiting to be had, she just knew it. All her life the fairy elders had warned her not to venture out from the protection of the woods. But maybe the unknown wasn't so perilous after all? Daisy closed her eyes and imagined soaring far past the forest's reach and discovering fantastic places and creatures she had only ever read about in books. Oh, how she dreamed of being bold and brave enough to make her fantasies real. But Daisy always ended up dutifully flying back to the shade of the ancient trees she had always called home. With a small sigh, Daisy stood and brushed violet petals off her dress. She couldn't linger too long in daydreams or the elders would scold her idleness. As Daisy turned to fly back towards the village and her daily tasks, she glanced over her shoulder once more at the hazy horizon. Someday, she told herself silently. Someday I will find the courage within me to fly all the way to that beautiful somewhere and see the world. Daisy held fast to that hope as she returned to the shelter of the fairy forest, flitting around the gnarled branches and mossy trunks of the old-growth trees. The realm of magic and ancient wonder embraced her, but her soul yearned to learn what lay beyond its leafy borders. Chapter 2. The next morning, Daisy awoke with a familiar restlessness stirring in her heart. As she went through her daily routine, her mind kept wandering back to the rolling hills at the edge of the woods. She couldn't stop thinking about the adventures that surely awaited her somewhere past the forest's reach. After breakfast, Daisy decided she needed to clear her head with a long, aimless flight. She left her cottage and darted around the mushroom homes and flower gardens of the village, waving to her neighbors. Many of them called out warnings to be careful and not fly too far, but Daisy just smiled and nodded. Once the village was behind her, Daisy zoomed through sun-dappled clearings and over babbling brooks swollen with spring rain. The vibrant sights and sounds of the woods usually lifted her spirits, but today Daisy felt restless. She realized her aimless flight had purposefully led her to the meadow at the forest's edge. Hovering over the violet blooms, Daisy's eyes were drawn to the rolling green hills fading into the horizon. The urge to discover what lay beyond the woods welled up stronger than ever inside her. Daisy's wings fluttered faster with excitement at the thought of leaving the confines of the forest and embarking on a real adventure. Daisy whispered to herself, "Today is the day." With that proclamation, she turned towards the break in the trees that opened to the outside world. Taking a deep breath, Daisy surged forward, flying faster than she ever had before. The wind rushed over her face and blew her hair back as the border grew closer. Just before crossing the tree line, Daisy hesitated. A lifetime of warnings about the dangers that lurked outside the woods echoed in her mind. What if the elders had been right? But her longing for adventure burned too strongly now to ignore. "It's time to see for myself what the world holds," Daisy declared. With a burst of speed, Daisy burst through the leaves and branches until the sheltered woods fell away behind her. She pumped her wings hard, determined to fly further than she ever had from her forest home. The morning sun shone warmly on her face as the fresh breeze carried her further into the unknown. Daisy flew over her familiar violet meadow, which now seemed to stretch on forever without the border of trees. Small cottages and fences appeared below as she entered the lands of men. Daisy swooped down to inspect a farmhouse, enchanted by the strange creatures like chickens and pigs in the pens. Circling back up high, Daisy scanned the patchwork fields and pastures laid out beneath her in a green quilt. Far off she could see a village with tiny figures milling around small shops with thatched roofs. And beyond that, a castle clung to the top of a craggy hillside. "This is even more wonderful than I dreamed," Daisy exclaimed, doing joyful loops above the charming rural landscape. She had been so focused on the thrill of leaving home that the adventure itself now unfurled before her like a gift waiting to be unwrapped. Daisy zoomed towards the village excitedly, eager to discover all the human world could offer. She hid herself high in an oak tree and watched the villagers go about their day buying bread from the market, working in their craft shops, and leading horses down the dusty lanes. After observing the fascinating humans, Daisy fluttered unseen into the village and explored its nooks and crannies. She hitched a ride in a woman's basket full of laundry and gazed in awe at all the wares for sale, from fish to farming tools. The blacksmith hammered away as sparks flew from his forge. Finally Daisy came to the village square, surrounding a cheerful little fountain carved from white stone. Children chased each other around it as sunlight glittered on the water's surface. Unable to resist, Daisy zoomed down and allowed herself to be seen, figuring the children would not be frightened of a fairy. The children paused in their play to gasp and point excitedly at Daisy. They smiled and laughed in delight as she performed graceful loops for them. Daisy felt happy to bring a touch of magic to their day. But she soon realized a group of adults had noticed the commotion and were approaching with alarmed looks. Sensing possible danger, Daisy quickly hid herself again and flew up to perch on a roof. The adults tried in vain to find the little fairy as the children excitedly recounted the magical encounter. Daisy sighed with relief at her narrow escape as she gazed down at the disappointed adults and children. Daisy realized she would have to be much more careful interacting with humans now that she had ventured out from the secluded world of the fairies. But she did not regret her choice to leave home and see the human realm with her own eyes. This was just the start of the thrilling adventures to come. As the sun traveled across the sky, Daisy left the village and explored more of the countryside and villages dotting the landscape. Each had its own unique character and charm. By the time Daisy stopped on top of a windmill to rest as the sun set, she understood now why she had never felt fully content remaining in one place her whole life. There was a whole wide world to discover out here. Yet Daisy knew in her heart that her beautiful forest would always remain her true home. As night began to fall, Daisy turned and flew back in the direction she had come from. Guided by the stars and her instinct, she soon found the familiar line of trees that marked the edge of the fairy realm. Weary but exhilarated by her first foray into the human world, Daisy landed softly in her cozy cottage. She fell immediately into a deep but restless sleep, dreaming of the infinite adventures yet to come now that she had taken the first thrilling steps into the great unknown. Chapter 3. The next morning, Daisy awoke feeling invigorated. The previous day's adventure outside the confines of the fairy forest had only whetted her appetite for more exploration. After a quick breakfast, Daisy slipped out of her cottage, buzzing her wings excitedly. Today she would venture even further into the human world. Daisy flew above the clusters of mushroom homes and flower gardens, hoping none of the fairies would notice her sneaking off again. A few called out their typical warnings to be careful, which Daisy casually waved off. She felt confident now in the human realm after yesterday's successful outing. It wasn't long before Daisy burst through the wall of leaves marking the forest's edge, sunlight warming her face. She paused to get her bearings, then headed off in a new direction, determined to discover what lay over the horizon. Daisy fluttered higher and higher until the woods were just a small smudge of green below. Daisy gasped as an immense sapphire lake opened up beneath her, the water sparkling like countless gems in the morning light. In the distance, elegant towers clustered around the shore. Daisy realized it must be the castle she had glimpsed yesterday. She dove down to get a closer look at the majestic human domain. The castle was grander than Daisy had imagined, with countless turrets and archways carved from pale gray stone. Flags flapped from the parapets, each emblazoned with a coat of arms. Daisy admired the masterfully tended gardens exploding with sculpted hedges and vibrant flower beds. Marveling at the beauty humans could create, Daisy longed to explore inside. Being extra sneaky, Daisy fluttered through an open window into a massive hallway with a soaring arched ceiling. Priceless tapestries hung on the stone walls between Gothic windows. Daisy stifled a giggle, enjoying her stealthy castle adventure. She continued onward, ducking behind statues and vases whenever people passed by. Daisy was distracted by awe-inspiring sights around every corner, the bustling kitchens, an armory lined with swords, a library stuffed with more books than she thought existed. Daisy drifted along, invisible to the inhabitants as she uncovered each new wonder. She was oblivious to the passage of time, lost in her own little world of discovery. After hours of exploring, Daisy found herself in a silent corridor. She was about to turn back, when a partially open door caught her eye. Daisy couldn't resist peeking into the shadowy room, lit only by streaks of afternoon sun. She flew right up to a strange object that dominated the room. It was some sort of giant white birdcage made of finely wrought metal. Inside lay an array of bright toys, and in the center, a tiny bed fit for a fairy. Daisy immediately realized it was a trap. She spun around, but the door had slammed shut behind her. Heavy footsteps approached. Daisy desperately rattled the cage bars, but there was no escape. A hand roughly grabbed the cage with Daisy inside. She tumbled around, banging her wings painfully on the metal bars as she was lifted up. Daisy found herself staring into the grinning face of a large, ugly human man. He chuckled nastily at having caught a fairy. Daisy shrunk back in fear. Naughty little sprite thought it could sneak around my castle, eh? He boomed. I'll show you what happens to pointy-eared pests. He carried Daisy's cage through hallways and downstairs to a dreary dungeon. Daisy trembled, calling for help, but the villain just laughed louder. He threw her cage into a cell and locked the door. Have fun in your new fairy cage. At dawn, you'll be sold to a circus sideshow, the man said wickedly. Daisy slumped to the cage floor as his footsteps faded, leaving her in darkness. All her confidence and excitement had disappeared. Daisy despaired at her foolishness for drifting into this dangerous trap. The elders had been right that humans were a threat. Now she was alone, locked away in the dank dungeon of a castle she had so naively admired. Exhausted from her futile attempts to escape, Daisy finally drifted off into a fitful sleep full of nightmares. The next morning, Daisy woke to clanging metal. The evil man had returned to bring her to the awful circus. Daisy cowered at the back of her cage as he sneered and carried her upstairs into the bright light of day. She covered her eyes, dreading each step bringing her closer to her terrible fate. Suddenly, shouts rang out as the man was knocked to the floor. Daisy's cage tumbled from his hands, rolling across the tiles. Dazed, she peered out and saw a group of angry children wrestling the cursing man into submission. They quickly unlocked Daisy's cage. She zoomed out, free at last, and realizing these were the kids from the village who had seen her yesterday. Hurry, little fairy. Back to the forest, said a girl, shooing Daisy towards an open window. With profuse thanks, Daisy escaped the castle and soared back towards the sheltering woods faster than she had ever flown before. Breathless, Daisy landed under the familiar trees, collapsing into the soft grass. She had made it home, where she never should have strayed from. Daisy curled up on a mossy bed, emotionally and physically drained from her harrowing adventure. Maybe she wasn't ready for the human world after all. Chapter 4. The next few days, Daisy mostly kept to herself, still shaken by her traumatic capture in the human castle. She busied her hands with chores, tidying her little cottage and tending to her garden, but her mind kept reliving those terrible moments locked in the cage. Daisy replenished her pantry with berries picked in the dappled sunlight of the woods. Yet she took no joy in venturing out amongst the mossy trees and flowering meadows that had always brought her such peace. The forest now seemed confining rather than comforting. At night, Daisy lay awake, listening to the gentle sounds of the sleeping fairy village. She yearned for the excitement of adventure, but also feared risking such danger again. Her dreams drifted back to roaming freely high above glittering lakes and valleys bathed in sunshine. But they twisted into nightmares of being imprisoned once more. One sunny morning, Daisy sat listlessly on a stump at the edge of the village, unsure what to do with herself. Should she try to forget her harrowing experiences in the human world? Or was the thirst for adventure and discovery still embedded too deeply in her spirit? As she wrestled with these thoughts, a voice called out, "Good morning, Miss Daisy." Why the long face? Daisy looked up to see a quaint gnome ambling towards her. White whiskers poked out from under his ruddy pointy hat and leather apron. Daisy recognized him as Nyx, the village gnome who helped fairies with broken furniture and household repairs. "Hello, Nyx," Daisy replied with a half-hearted smile. She didn't really feel like talking, but Nyx's kind, honest face made her open up about her internal struggle. The old gnome listened thoughtfully before stroking his beard and speaking. "The world outside our woods is both wondrous and treacherous," Nyx said. "But we cannot truly live if our desire to explore is stifled by fear." He placed a comforting hand on Daisy's shoulder. "Perhaps you just need a guide to show you the proper paths beyond the trees." Daisy's eyes lit up at the thought. With an experienced companion like Nyx, maybe she really could satisfy her restless longing for adventure without succumbing to its perils. Daisy jumped up and hugged the surprised gnome, thanking him profusely for offering to be her guide. The next day, Daisy met Nyx at the edge of the woods and together they ventured out into the sunny countryside. Daisy marveled anew at all the simple charms she took for granted before, like daffodils dancing in the meadow grasses and cottages with smoke curling from their chimneys. With the steady gnome by her side, the world seemed fresh and full of promise again. Nyx taught Daisy which human villages were safe and which to avoid. Together they weaved between travelers on dusty roads, stealing secret glances at their lives. And when night fell, Nyx showed Daisy how to fashion shelters from bark and leaves to sleep nestled safely in the crooks of trees. When they returned home days later, Daisy bubbled over with all the wise new things she had learned thanks to Nyx's guidance and protection. She slept soundly, no longer haunted by nightmares. And by the next morning, Daisy was already eager to embark on another quest alongside her newfound friend into the great unknown. With renewed courage and caution, Daisy's adventures with Nyx expanded further across the map. He showed her stunning cities teeming with humans from around the world, clear lakes hosting vibrant festivals, and remote countrysides dotted with crops, livestock and friendly farmers. Always they returned safely to the fairy woods before nightfall. Daisy now moved through the human world with respect and wonder, sensing its dangers but also grasping its beauty and intrigue. She uncovered more magic in an ordinary dandelion than most humans noticed in a lifetime. Every day brought fresh marvels to be cherished once Daisy stopped taking any part of her precious life for granted. Nyx remained faithfully by Daisy's side, providing wisdom and protection but also letting the spirited fairy learn lessons in her own way. He understood her restless soul could only be satisfied by genuine freedom and discoveries. Together they found a happy balance during their travels beyond the sheltering trees of home. At day's end, lying atop a grassy hillock under the stars, Daisy would recount their adventures to Nyx in vivid detail. He never tired of hearing her excited voice regale every fascinating sight and encounter. In those moments, Daisy truly came to understand herself and all the possibilities life holds, both beautiful and terrible, if looked at as a wondrous gift. Chapter 5 Daisy skipped merrily through the dappled sunlight of the fairy forest, humming a cheerful tune. She wove between the ancient trees and moss-covered rocks with childlike delight. Today she and Nyx were venturing out again into the human world, and Daisy bubbled with excitement for their latest adventure. At the agreed meeting spot by a babbling creek, Daisy found Nyx packing provisions into his leather satchel. Dried berries, acorn cakes, a jar of nectar, he had thought of everything to satisfy a fairy's appetite. Daisy thanked the gnome and tucked the satchel over her shoulders. Off they went into the sunny unknown. Daisy floated alongside Nyx as they hiked over gentle hills and down country lanes bordered by blossoming wildflowers. Daisy danced from flower to flower, inhaling their sweet scents. After her frightening experiences, it felt liberating to appreciate the simple joys around her once more. Eventually, Nyx and Daisy came upon a humble human village. Wooden cottages with hay-thatched roofs lined the dusty main road. Daisy eyed the villagers warily, but Nyx patted her hand reassuringly. "These are innocent country folk, my dear." Soon Daisy found herself eagerly exploring the charming village while still keeping herself hidden. She hitched rides in the buckets of the town well and gazed in awe at all the wares for sale: handmade quilts, fresh produce, clay pots, herbs and tinctures. The aroma of freshly baked bread wafted from the bakery. As Daisy snuck around a stable admiring the handsome horses, a commotion at the entrance caught her attention. A boy around 8 years old burst in, looking heavily bruised, with tears streaming down his cheeks. Daisy felt her heart lurch for the poor child. Before she could stop herself, Daisy fluttered right up to the bewildered boy. "Why do you cry, little one?" she asked gently. The boy just stared in shock at the tiny winged girl who had appeared. Daisy landed on a hay bale and beckoned him to sit beside her. Haltingly, the child explained he was an orphan who worked for the stable owner. Some village boys had beaten him up earlier that day. Daisy frowned angrily at the injustice, but told the boy not to despair. She introduced herself warmly and allowed him to behold her shimmering wings up close. Soon the boy, named Owen, was laughing in delight at the new fairy friend he could scarcely believe was real. Daisy wove flowers into a crown and placed it on Owen's head, telling him he was the king of the forest now. For that one magical hour, he forgot the cruelty of the world that had made him cry. But Daisy knew she couldn't linger long. Bidding Owen farewell with a kiss on the forehead, she promised to come check on him again when she was able. Then Daisy slipped out the stable window, hiding herself again before any adults noticed the fairy and boy. Daisy found Nyx anxious with worry in the town square. She quickly recounted her encounter with Owen, expecting a stern lecture about revealing herself to humans. But the old gnome just smiled wisely instead. Some hearts need a touch of magic when they have seen too much tragedy, he said simply. In the days that followed, Daisy found her thoughts returning often to the stable boy Owen. She itched to explore the villages and roads less traveled with Nyx. But an idea had taken hold: what if they brought Owen along on an adventure? Surely the boy deserved a respite from his hard life. Finally Daisy revealed her intent to Nyx. The gnome looked uncertain, but knew he could not deter the sympathetic fairy's mind once set. The lad does seem to need rescuing, Nyx reluctantly agreed. I suppose one trip could do no harm. The very next morning, Daisy could hardly contain her excited energy as she and Nyx approached the stable. Owen's eyes lit up with disbelief and joy when the two appeared. After obtaining his eager agreement, Nyx snuck the boy out past the still sleeping owner. Together, the odd trio plunged into the forest road, Owen seated on Nyx's shoulders. The boy whooped and hollered with delight as Nyx pointed out various flora and fauna, Daisy weaving fanciful stories about the sights. She was glad to repay Owen's earlier kindness with this special adventure. By midday, they stopped for a picnic by a crystalline pond. As Owen munched on Nyx's food, Daisy fashioned toy boats from leaves and twigs for them to sail. Their merry laughter rang through the trees. For once, Owen looked every bit the carefree child he deserved to be. The day passed all too quickly. As the sun lowered, they headed back through the dappled woods. Owen clutched his leaf boat and flower crown, reluctant to return to his dreary life. But Daisy promised this would not be his last adventure. Back home, she embraced Owen fiercely before he snuck back into the stable. That night around the campfire, Daisy saw Nyx gazing at her thoughtfully. You have a kind heart, Miss Daisy, he said. Not all can see magic lies not in our realm alone, but in how we touch the lives of others. Daisy nestled in her leaf blanket, smiling to herself. She could hardly wait to see Owen's face light up with wonder again. Chapter 6. The very next day, Daisy could hardly contain her excitement as she zipped through the fairy village on her way to meet Nyx. They were taking Owen on another adventure today. She hoped it would offer the boy respite from his difficult life once more. Nyx was waiting patiently, picnic basket in hand, when Daisy arrived at their meeting spot. Though still hesitant about bringing a human child along, the wise gnome knew this gave Daisy joy. Together they set off down the forest path towards town. Daisy drank in the beauty around her, dapples of sunlight dancing on the leafy path, a herd of deer grazing in a sunlit meadow, crystalline water babbling over mossy stones. She thrilled at the prospect of seeing Owen's eyes light up experiencing the magic for himself. Soon the village came into view. Daisy and Nyx stealthily made their way to the stable. As they entered, Daisy called softly for Owen. When there was no response, she exchanged a worried glance with Nyx. Where was the boy? Suddenly, shouts rang out from the pasture behind the stable. Daisy and Nyx rushed outside to find a gang of older boys shoving Owen to the ground. They yelled insults and kicked dirt in his face. Owen struggled against them, but was clearly outmatched. Daisy immediately zoomed into the fray, unable to watch Owen's torment another second. Leave him alone, you brutes, she yelled. The boys froze in shock at the tiny, winged girl darting around their heads. Daisy pulled Owen free of the scuffle. But the boys soon realized a puny fairy posed little threat. They laughed and swatted at Daisy. One boy snatched her roughly out of the air. Daisy cried out in pain as he squeezed her in his fist. Nyx shouted and swung his walking stick at them, but he was also overwhelmed. Owen watched in horror as his two magical friends who had shown him such kindness were being tortured by the very bullies, who always tormented him. Suddenly, something defiant flared up in Owen's heart. Let them go, he screamed. Channeling all his rage and courage, Owen barreled into the boy holding Daisy, knocking him backward. Owen kicked and thrashed wildly, not caring that he was outnumbered. Daisy wriggled free during the confusion and flashed Owen a grateful smile. Spurred on by Owen's bravery, Daisy and Nyx fought back against the brutes with renewed fury. Daisy pulled hair, bit toes and jabbed with her sharp wings. Nyx walloped the boys with his stick if they grabbed at the feisty fairy. Soon the cowards were running away in pain and fright. With the three friends nursing their minor battle wounds, Owen haltingly apologized for putting Daisy and Nyx in harm's way. But Daisy shushed him, saying she was proud of his valiant defense of them. "You are truly the king of the forest now," Daisy declared with a grin. Their picnic adventure was postponed for the day. But Daisy and Nyx insisted on escorting Owen back home, lest the bullies return. Brushing a shock of hair from Owen's dirty forehead, Daisy promised to come back soon so their adventures could continue. After a fond farewell, the pair slipped away into the woods once more. That night by the glow of their campfire, Daisy excitedly recounted for Nyx every detail of Owen's heroic stand against his tormentors. The old gnome looked pensive as he poked at the flickering flames with his stick. "You and the boy bring out great courage in each other," Nyx said thoughtfully. Daisy smiled at the compliment, but her joy was tinged with sadness at saying goodbye to Owen earlier. She wished fervently that their paths hadn't diverged at the end of the lane. But Daisy trusted they would meet again soon for more magical adventures. Owen's world was already much brighter with two loyal friends looking out for him. Chapter 7. The next morning, Daisy awoke feeling restless. She missed Owen's sweet face already. Daisy decided to pay him a visit at the stable to check in before today's adventure with Nyx. She gulped down a quick breakfast of berries and nectar before heading out. Daisy zoomed through the sleepy fairy village, waving half-heartedly at her neighbors. She felt too impatient to stop and chat. Soon Daisy emerged from the shady woods and flew over sunny meadows towards town. At the stable, Daisy called softly for Owen. When there was no response, she felt a twinge of worry. But sudden shouts from the pasture made her jump. Daisy rushed over, afraid the bullies had returned. Instead, she found Owen running excitedly after a yellow butterfly, laughing each time it eluded his grasping hands. Daisy laughed too at the joyful sight. Owen grinned when he noticed his fairy friend. Daisy was glad he seemed untroubled today. After chatting a bit, Owen went back to his chores. Daisy turned to head off and meet Nyx, but something made her pause. She felt drawn to linger at the stable a bit longer for some reason. Perching atop a fence post, Daisy closed her eyes and just allowed the bright sounds and smells of the countryside to wash over her. Without warning, a blood-curdling scream rang out, seeming to shake the very ground. Daisy's eyes shot open. Owen came barreling around the stable, his face white with terror. "Mr. Barnes is dead," he cried. Daisy's stomach dropped. Mr. Barnes was the stable owner, an elderly, ornery man who still showed Owen a bit of mercy. Owen babbled that he had found Mr. Barnes lying still as stone inside. He begged Daisy to come see. Dread pooling in her gut, Daisy followed Owen into the tiny attached cottage where Mr. Barnes lived. Her wings fluttered uneasily as she approached the figure sprawled on the floor. Daisy stifled a scream herself. Mr. Barnes was unmistakably dead. Owen clutched Daisy tightly, both stunned by the nightmarish scene. But something about the old man's lifeless pose stirred Daisy's curiosity. She cautiously pried herself from Owen's grip and fluttered closer to the body, peering intently. Daisy gasped. "Look." Daisy pointed. Around Mr. Barnes's wrinkled neck were clear red marks. "Fingerprints." Owen's eyes widened in shock. He stammered it must have been those awful boys playing a cruel trick. But Daisy knew these full-grown marks could only mean one thing: murder. Daisy's mind raced, wondering who could have done something so evil. She thought of all the people she had observed in the village over the past days. Daisy wished fiercely that Nyx was there to make sense of this horror using his wisdom. Owen's panicked weeping broke Daisy from her frantic thoughts. She had to get the poor boy to safety. Taking his hand, Daisy led Owen gently but firmly outside into the fresh air and sunlight, far from the vile scene. She promised they would tell the village constable so Mr. Barnes could be properly buried. As Owen's shock subsided, anger and fear flooded his ruddy face. Those monsters! Owen shouted, fingers digging into the dirt. If they killed old Barnes, they won't stop until I'm dead too. He grabbed Daisy's shoulders desperately. You have to help me warn the fairies. We're all in danger. Daisy reeled at the implication. Surely whoever committed this evil act wouldn't dare harm her people in their secluded sanctuary. But gazing into Owen's panic-stricken eyes, Daisy knew they had to tell Nyx what had happened. Perhaps a storm beyond even her worst nightmares was brewing outside their sheltered walls. Taking Owen's trembling hand again, Daisy led him swiftly towards the forest. Her mind rang with alarm, but her voice remained soothing. Come, we will go see Nyx. We will make sure everyone is safe. Owen nodded, fresh tears streaking his dirt-smudged cheeks. Together, they plunged into the shadows of the woods. Chapter 8. Daisy pulled Owen deeper into the dim forest, her heart pounding. She kept glancing over her shoulder, irrationally feeling they were being followed. Owen gripped her hand tightly as they stumbled over gnarled roots and mossy stones. Up ahead, Daisy finally spotted Nyx's little gnome home, its stone chimney puffing comforting wisps of smoke. She called out the gnome's name in desperation. Nyx came rushing from his workshop, startled by Daisy's frantic tone. Daisy quickly sat Owen down and placed a mug of hot chamomile tea in his shaky hands. She then took Nyx aside and rapidly recounted the horrific scene they had discovered at the stable. Nyx stroked his beard gravely as Daisy described Mr. Barnes' murder. And Owen is convinced the killer is after him and the fairies next, Daisy whispered. Is it possible the sanctuary is in danger? Nyx's eyes darkened ominously, but he simply squeezed Daisy's shoulder and said they would get to the bottom of this. Turning back to Owen, Nyx spoke gently, asking him to describe everything he saw and heard that morning in detail. The boy took a deep breath and slowly recounted waking up excited to see Daisy again, then his blood-curdling discovery of Mr. Barnes. And you have no idea who could have done this? Nyx pressed. Owen shook his head helplessly. Daisy chimed in, I sensed real evil in that cottage. We have to find the crystal now, before. She trailed off, not wanting to alarm Owen further. Nyx nodded gravely, understanding Daisy's cryptic meaning. The crystal's protection was needed urgently if such malevolence now lurked outside their borders. He gruffly instructed Owen to wait there while he and Daisy set off at once to find the gem before nightfall. Though confused, Owen trusted his two friends. Daisy gulped down her last sip of tea for strength and courage. She then followed Nyx into the shadowy woods, away from the now dozing boy. When they had gone some distance, Nyx stopped and turned to Daisy somberly. The crystal is hidden in a secret place seen only by each gnome elder in turn, he whispered. But you were right, with evil so near, we must recover it today. Daisy tightened her fists resolutely. She would not fail Nyx or the fairies. Nyx led them deeper into increasingly gnarled and overgrown parts of the forest. The buzz and chirp of insects was the only sound. At last, they reached a rocky outcropping looming over a ravine. A narrow opening led inside. Taking a torch, Nyx motioned for Daisy to follow him into the cave. The cave walls glittered with quartz and mica as they descended eerily into the earth. Daisy stayed close behind Nyx, eyes darting around for any sign of the crystal. Just as the passage narrowed dangerously, it opened into a small cavern. Daisy gasped. There in the center sat an enormous geode, its purple crystals shimmering in the torchlight. Daisy's heart swelled gazing upon the legendary gem which had protected her homeland for centuries. She blinked grateful tears from her eyes as Nyx reverently brushed dust from the giant amethyst. Quickly now, help me dislodge it, Nyx whispered. The pair gripped the geode and heaved with all their might. It came loose from its rocky base and Nyx hoisted it into his rucksack. Exchanging relieved smiles, they turned to head out of the cave with their precious cargo. But a deafening rumble stopped them in their tracks. Dust rained down from above. Daisy cried out as a boulder dislodged, crashing down and trapping them inside the rapidly collapsing cave. Nyx and Daisy coughed amidst the thickening dust, terror gripping them. The opening. Daisy shouted hoarsely. They scrambled desperately over the fallen rocks as more slammed down. Light filtered through just ahead. With a final burst of effort, they dove out of the cave just as tons of rock sealed the entrance behind them with a thunderous boom. Daisy and Nyx collapsed in the dirt, their torch extinguished. They clung to each other, catching their breath, hardly believing they had just escaped being buried alive. After a few moments, Nyx laughed with relief. "The crystal is safe now, my dear. Let us away before darker forces find our trail." Excitement rose in Daisy's chest. She helped Nyx to his feet and they hurried off into the woods, eager to get the crystal back to the village. Daisy smiled to herself, knowing that with this ancient magic in hand, Owen and all the fairies would finally be protected from looming evil. Chapter 9. Daisy could hardly contain her relief and excitement as she and Nyx emerged from the rocky cavern into the sunlit forest, the amethyst crystal safely in their possession. But they had only just stepped onto the leafy path when an arrow whizzed by overhead. "Duck!" Nyx shouted. He and Daisy dropped to the ground just as another arrow split the air where they had stood moments before. Nyx whispered harshly for Daisy to follow him quickly. They scampered on hands and knees into the brush lining the path. Peeking out from their hiding spot, Daisy spotted 3 armed men standing at the cave entrance, cursing and yelling about it being blocked. She stifled a gasp, realizing these must be the evil forces tracking them. More arrows zipped by as Nyx pulled Daisy deeper under cover. They stealthily paralleled the path as the men stomped around searching for them. When the sounds of the pursuers faded ahead, Nyx and Daisy cautiously emerged to follow the trail in the opposite direction. Staying low, they hurried as fast as they could without making a sound. Daisy's heart slammed against her ribs. How had those villains found them so fast? She glanced worriedly at the bulging rucksack on Nyx's back. They had to get the precious crystal to safety. Nyx led them on a roundabout route through wild thickets and over springs to throw off their trail. At last, the lights of the fairy village peeked through the trees ahead. Daisy could have wept with joy at the familiar glow of home. But Nyx held out an arm, stopping Daisy short on the path. His eyes narrowed, staring ahead. Daisy followed his gaze and realized with horror what had given him pause. Surrounding the village were strange men with weapons and contraptions she had never seen. "Poachers," Nyx growled under his breath. Daisy choked back a scream. The fairy sanctuary had already been invaded by the evil forces. Peering closer, she could see fairies in cages being loaded into wagons. Smoke rose from burnt mushroom homes. Rage and despair raged through Daisy. Their village, their families, and friends. She started to buzz her wings, ready to fly straight into battle. But Nyx yanked her back into the bushes. "We cannot help them now," he said bitterly. "We must protect the crystal." Tears streaming down her face, Daisy knew the wise gnome was right. As much as it tore her heart, she turned away from the horrid scene. Nyx spoke reassuring words as they slipped away silently into the darkness. Daisy sent up prayers that some fairies had managed to escape and hide. For hours they trekked under the shelter of night towards the oak grove where Nyx had instructed Owen to remain. Daisy fretted over the boy and if the killers had already found him. But as the grove came into view, she saw no signs of disturbance. At Nyx's owl call, Owen came stumbling out from under a tangled root, rubbing sleepy eyes. Daisy almost knocked him over, so fiercely did she embrace him. Laughing through her tears, she thanked the stars he was all right. Owen looked confused, but returned the hug happily. While Daisy distracted Owen by feigning cheerfulness, Nyx pulled her again aside. "You must go with the boy," the old gnome ordered. "Keep him and the crystal safe." Daisy's brow furrowed anxiously. But Nyx squeezed her shoulder, repeating, "The crystal and the boy, they are hope. Now go." Daisy knew there was no time to argue. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she turned and took Owen's hand, blinking back more tears. The pair slipped into the night, the ominous hoots of hunting owls echoing behind them. Daisy prayed Nyx was right that she and Owen together could somehow still turn this darkness to light. Chapter 10. Daisy led Owen by the hand through the dark, unfamiliar forest, too afraid to stop even for a moment. The horrors she had witnessed at the fairy village replayed in her mind, fueling her desperation to get as far away as possible. Owen struggled to keep up as Daisy pulled him over fallen logs and through tangled thickets. He kept asking what was happening and where Nyx was. Daisy just shook her head, unable to speak of the trauma. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Finally, as dawn light began filtering through the trees, Daisy allowed them to stop in a small clearing to catch their breath. Owen collapsed on the grass, chest heaving. Daisy wanted to comfort him, but she had to ensure they had not been followed. She scouted the perimeter, listening for any suspicious sounds. Satisfied they were alone, Daisy returned to find Owen sitting up with his arms crossed, face covered in dirt and tears. "Please tell me what's going on," he pleaded angrily. "And where's Nyx?" Daisy took a deep breath. She owed Owen an explanation after dragging him all night through the woods. As gently as she could, Daisy recounted finding the fairy village ransacked and Nyx insisting she take Owen to safety. The boy listened in horror, fresh tears welling up. "But why me?" Owen asked. Daisy hesitated. She could not yet reveal their possession of the crystal. Owen had endured enough shock for one day. So Daisy just squeezed his hand, saying Nyx believed he and Daisy must stick together now. Owen seemed to accept this for the moment. As the sun climbed in the sky, the pair foraged for berries and mushrooms to eat. Owen even managed a small smile when Daisy wove a crown of daisies for him, reminiscent of more innocent times. Her heart ached remembering their carefree adventures. Feeling relatively secure for the first time since the cave, Daisy allowed herself and Owen to rest under the shade of an oak. But sleep's reprieve did not last long. Daisy was jarred awake by shouting and snarling beasts. Peering out, she gasped to see men on horseback approaching with dogs snapping at their heels. "Hide!" Daisy cried, shoving Owen under a log and debris. She dove into the bushes just as the men crashed into the camp, cursing that it appeared empty. Through the leaves, Daisy met Owen's wide, frightened eyes. She put a finger to her lips as the men stomped around frustratingly. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of departing hooves faded. Daisy and Owen emerged shakily from hiding. They could not risk resting again with search parties on their trail. Daisy coaxed Owen to his tired feet. They must keep moving. For the next few days, Daisy and Owen traveled only under cover of darkness to avoid detection. Enduring cold, hunger and exhaustion, they pushed westward away from the rising sun. Daisy glimpsed Owen growing more hollow and hopeless with each passing mile. She worried that even his spirit could be broken. One gray morning, Daisy decided they desperately needed refuge and allies. The rocky hills and ravines reminded her of the gnome colony she and Nyx had once encountered. If any allies still existed, it would be there. Daisy just prayed she could find the well-hidden settlement again. As dusk fell, hope leapt in Daisy's heart at the sight of a familiar stone formation up ahead. She followed her instincts through zigzagging ravines until finally they came upon a jumble of rocky structures tucked beneath an overhang. Voices could be heard from inside. "Hello?" Daisy called out. A gnome head poked from a window, then yelled to others. Soon, a delegation of gnomes surrounded Daisy and Owen. Daisy greeted them warmly, immensely relieved for friendly faces. The gnomes quickly welcomed them inside their underground haven. That night, snug in a bunk beside Owen in the glowing cave settlement, Daisy felt they were one step closer to safety. With gnome allies, she believed they could craft a plan to make a final stand against these forces of evil. She fell into her first restful sleep in many nights. Chapter 11. Daisy awoke feeling refreshed for the first time in days within the cozy cavern quarters the gnomes had provided. Owen still slept soundly in the bunk beside her, his dirty face finally relaxed and peaceful. Daisy tucked the blankets more snugly around him before heading out. The gnomes offered Daisy and Owen a hearty breakfast of potato cakes and tea. As they ate, Daisy recounted all they had endured since finding the crystal. The gnomes listened grimly, expressing sorrow over the attack on Daisy's village. They promised to help keep Owen and the gem safe. After breakfast, Daisy joined several gnome scouts to comb the surrounding hills for signs of intruders. She scouted from high above while the gnomes searched the crags and caves below. But they found no traces of the evil poachers nearby. Returning to the settlement as dusk fell, Daisy felt profoundly grateful for this one day of respite. Lamplight glowed warmly from gnome homes carved into the cavern walls. The air rang with the happy sounds of families preparing dinner together. For a moment, Daisy could imagine she was back in her own village, untouched by darkness. But she knew the fantasy could not last. Evil still lurked, seeking the crystal. They had to move again soon. As Daisy wandered aimlessly, she bumped right into Owen, who looked revived after a long nap. Daisy smiled, brushing the hair from his forehead fondly. "These caves make me think of home," Owen said wistfully, gazing around. He told Daisy stories of playing hide and seek with other children in caves near the orphanage where he grew up. Daisy laughed aloud hearing Owen speak of happy memories for once, rather than recent horrors. The next morning, Daisy met with the gnome elders to strategize their next move. They pored over maps of the surrounding lands, looking for an escape route that would avoid areas the poachers likely controlled. After much debate, they agreed traveling west toward the sea seemed safest. Daisy gathered provisions for herself and Owen as the boy said his farewells to the gnome children he had quickly befriended. Though nervous to venture out again, Owen also looked excited imagining the ocean, which he had only heard tales of before. Daisy's heart swelled to see his enthusiasm returning. The gnomes offered Daisy one of their sturdy ponies to speed their journey. After hugging her gracious hosts, she and Owen set off riding eagerly toward the setting sun. A wide river served as their compass, the sea growing nearer each day as they followed its winding path downhill. Daisy let herself enjoy this leg of the journey, picnicking with Owen in green meadows, telling stories around their crackling campfire at night. Owen's eyes shone again with curiosity rather than fear. He reminded Daisy to keep appreciating each moment, though uncertainty still lay ahead. But that uncertainty returned swiftly one morning when Daisy awoke to discover Owen gone from their campsite. Frantic, she searched the surroundings but found only scattered footsteps leading away. Sick fear gripped Daisy. Had the poachers kidnapped him in the night? Just as panic threatened to overtake her, Daisy heard Owen shout her name. She spun to see him bounding down the riverbank, waving excitedly. The boy gasped that he had spotted pink salmon leaping upstream at dawn. He begged Daisy to come see the incredible sight. Daisy sagged to her knees, half laughing and half sobbing with relief. She wanted to scold Owen for wandering off, but the joy on his flushed face melted her anger. Taking his outstretched hand, Daisy let him lead her to watch the vibrant fish swirling in the river's shallows. The beauty of the moment washed away her fears. That night by the fire, Daisy gazed at Owen's sleeping face, feeling immense gratitude they still had each other. She prayed to the stars they would stay side by side facing whatever lay ahead. Above, wispy clouds drifted across the waxing moon as it rose to illuminate their westward path. Chapter 12. Daisy awoke before dawn, too anxious to sleep. Today she and Owen would finally reach the sea after weeks of arduous travel. Daisy let the boy slumber a bit longer as she packed up camp alone. Her nerves were on edge. Would they find safe passage across the waters? Or would their journey end here? Once the sun peaked above the horizon, Daisy gently shook Owen awake. His eyes went wide remembering what day it was. Daisy managed an encouraging smile. After a quick breakfast, they set off again following the river towards the mythical ocean. Around midday, Daisy noticed a change in the air. It held a new scent both briny and sweet. The river widened steadily until finally, it flowed into an immense blue expanse that met the sky. Daisy gasped, "The sea." It was more breathtaking than she had ever imagined. Beside her, Owen whooped with unrestrained delight. He chased the waves frothing onto shore, laughing as they playfully splashed him back. Daisy's heart swelled watching Owen's unbridled joy. She released her own shouts of glee, allowing the wind to dance wildly through her hair. That evening they camped on the white sand beach, lulled to sleep by the soothing roar of the waves. Daisy dreamed of soaring over sapphire waters without end. For the first time in forever, her sleep was untroubled by nightmares of the evil pursuing them. The sea seemed to have washed their worries momentarily away. When Daisy mentioned this tentatively the next morning, Owen enthusiastically agreed. He pointed out how insignificant their problems felt gazing upon the vast, timeless ocean. Daisy pondered his words. She resolved to hold on to this liberating new perspective, no matter what tribulations lay ahead. Their journey was far from over, but Daisy felt emboldened by the changing scenery and Owen's buoyant mood. The sea breeze seemed to infuse her spirit with renewed hope and courage. After days of relishing the freedom of the shoreline, Daisy was prepared again to face the stretch of their quest. As they walked the craggy coast searching for passage, Daisy and Owen came across weathered docks where small fishing boats bobbed. Daisy had avoided human dwellings for weeks, but she felt strangely compelled to approach one particular lonely cottage. Her instincts had sharpened over the arduous journey. She called a greeting at the cottage door. After a pause, a stooped old fisherman appeared. To Daisy's surprise, his craggy face crinkled into a smile at the sight of her wings. "A fairy maiden," he exclaimed. "Been years since your folk visited." Daisy soon learned the man's name was Claude. His grandfather had been friends with fairies and gnomes. Claude agreed without hesitation to aid Daisy's quest. By nightfall, his boat was stocked and ready to ferry them across the sea, far from the evil forces that hunted them. Daisy nearly wept at the kindness of strangers. As the boat slipped away under a pearly moon, Daisy hugged Owen close. She whispered that they would stay together no matter where the tides took them. Owen nodded bravely, releasing a long yawn. Soon he was asleep on Daisy's shoulder as she kept watch over the glimmering waves. Their journey was far from over, but she felt lighter knowing there was still goodness left in the world. Chapter 13. Daisy stood at the bow of the creaking boat, wind whipping wildly through her hair as they sailed further into the moonlit sea. She kept one arm protectively around Owen's shoulders as he slept curled against her. Despite their perilous situation, Daisy's heart swelled with hope gazing ahead into the great unknown. When pink tendrils of dawn light stretched across the clouds, Daisy gently shook Owen awake. His eyes grew wide taking in the endless water and sky surrounding their tiny boat. Daisy pointed excitedly to a dark smudge on the horizon that must be land. Their journey was nearing its next step. Claude confirmed Daisy's guess as correct, that Shadow was an island where they could rest and resupply for the longer voyage ahead. Daisy's wings fluttered eagerly at the thought of feeling solid ground again instead of constant rocking waves. Owen looked invigorated too, peppering Claude with questions about what adventures awaited on the island. By midday, their boat bumped against a weathered pier extending from white sand beaches. Daisy could hardly wait to explore and stretch her legs. But Claude held her back, whispering that these islands could still hold dangers. He sent Daisy and Owen to gather firewood so he could scout around first. Daisy chafed at the delay, but knew the wise sailor was just being cautious. She kept close to Owen as they combed the dense tropical forest lining the shore, marveling at the lush exotic plants and chittering birds. Their arms were soon piled high with fallen branches and kindling. Returning to the beach at twilight, Daisy called for Claude but received no reply. Worry rising, she told Owen to wait by the boats while she searched for any sign of the sailor. Daisy followed faint boot tracks until a flicker of light through the trees stopped her. Peering into the jungle, Daisy saw a clearing surrounded by painted men in colorful garb. A large fire blazed at its center. Daisy stifled a horrified gasp realizing Claude was tied to a pole beside the flames. Masked figures danced menacingly around him with spears. Daisy's mind raced, wondering how she could possibly rescue Claude from the native tribe. But it was too late. A chant arose and a tribesman flung his spear. Daisy clutched her throat, choking back a scream as the weapon pierced Claude's heart. She whirled around, nearly crashing right into Owen. "We have to save Claude," the boy cried. Daisy just shook her head, tears flowing freely as she pulled Owen back towards the safety of the beach. She had failed the kindly sailor who risked his life to help them. But Daisy knew their only choice now was to escape this island immediately. The tide was still high when they pushed off in Claude's boat under the cover of darkness. Owen rowed as Daisy wept silently, watching the island that had claimed their friend disappear behind them. She said a prayer, hoping Claude's spirit would find peace. All they could do now was continue on, more alone and adrift than ever. The next days blurred together in a haze of scorching sun, rationed dried meat, and long restless nights on the hard planks of the boat. Owen stayed cheerful, reminding Daisy that the stars would guide them to a new home someday. She managed weak smiles for him, but inside her hope flickered dimly. One afternoon, storms rolled in, whipping the calm sea into enormous frothing peaks. Rain lashed down as the boat heaved and tilted sickeningly. Owen screamed as a monstrous wave crashed over them, sweeping him into the churning abyss before Daisy could even reach for him. "No!" Daisy cried hoarsely, peering desperately into the gray chaos. But Owen was gone, swallowed by the merciless sea. Daisy had no time to grieve as the boat finally capsized, plunging her into the stormy waters too. The currents tossed her in every direction until she knew no more. Daisy drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes feeling rough sand beneath her. When she fully woke, it took several moments for her blurry eyes to adjust to her surroundings: palm trees, white beach, and crystal waves. She was back on the very same island. At first Daisy wondered if it had all been a terrible nightmare. But the absence of Owen and Claude at her side confirmed her despairing reality. She had failed them both, and now she was stranded on this island alone. As the sun set blood red over the lonely shore, Daisy wept. Chapter 14. Daisy awoke to blinding sun and birdsong in the island jungle. For a brief moment, she forgot the horrors of the previous day. But turning to the empty beach beside her, the awful truth came crashing back. Owen was gone. Her dear friend lost forever to the sea's cruel depths. Hot tears spilled down Daisy's cheeks. Owen had trusted her, and she had failed him. After all they endured together, fate had ripped the sweet boy from her side when she needed him most. Daisy sobbed into the sand, overcome by grief. As the sun rose higher, Daisy knew she had to keep moving somehow. Lying here helpless would surely mean demise. Slowly, she gained her feet, leaning on her staff Claude had carved. She touched the ocean-smoothed stone tied at its top, her last memento of Owen. Daisy aimlessly followed the titterline, but no path revealed itself. She was well and truly trapped on this island that had already proven itself dangerous. As she crab-walked over lava rock shelves, Daisy's staff suddenly slipped from her hands. She watched helplessly as it was carried out by the surf. Falling to her knees, Daisy finally broke down entirely. All was lost. Her friends were gone, her quest failed. She peered up accusingly at the empty blue sky and screamed all her rage and sorrow until her voice went hoarse. Only the crying gulls answered back. When her tears finally dried, Daisy remained unmoving on the black lava shore. What was left for her in this world? She had no home, no one left who needed her. Perhaps it would be a mercy to surrender herself to the waves' embrace as Owen had. Daisy rose slowly and walked until she stood chest-deep in the frothing whitecaps. As she prepared to take the final plunge into the blue depths, a distant cry made her pause. Was that Owen's voice? No, impossible. But there it rang out again. Daisy's eyes desperately raked the rocky coast. And there, hobbling along, waving his arms frantically, was Owen. Bruised and bloodied, but miraculously alive. Daisy cried out his name, splashing towards shore faster than she had ever swum before. They collided in a fierce embrace on the sand, both weeping and laughing with disbelief. Owen explained he had clung to driftwood until washing up here barely conscious. But he never lost hope they would reunite. Daisy hugged him tighter, feeling her own hope reborn. That night they celebrated Owen's return around a bonfire, roasting wild boar Owen proudly tracked and speared himself. As Daisy gazed at the boy happily devouring meat across the flames, she made a silent vow. Never again would she allow despair to overwhelm and blind her. Not while Owen still needed her. In the days that followed, Daisy's spirits lifted and purpose returned. She and Owen foraged for sustenance and built a sturdy shelter from bamboo and palm leaves. They gained strength together each day, sometimes even managing to laugh and play on the beach as if they were children again. But Daisy knew the island could not be their permanent refuge. Evil still lurked beyond the horizon, threatening all they held dear. They needed to complete their quest, for the sake of those left behind. Daisy dreamed often of home, imagining the faces of Nyx and all the fairies she had sworn to protect. One humid afternoon, Daisy returned from gathering mangoes to find Owen whistling cheerfully as he tied together bamboo into a raft frame. Her brow furrowed worriedly, but Owen assured her it was time to leave this place. He was ready for whatever came next. As they floated away the next dawn on their rickety raft, Daisy knew their lives teetered between hope and doom once more. But the island was shrinking behind them and Owen was at her side. She chose to believe, for now, that fate could still guide them home. Chapter 15. Daisy stood balancing carefully atop the bamboo raft as Owen used a pole to push them over the gentle waves. The waters shimmered beautifully in the dawnlight, but Daisy's eyes were fixed straight ahead. Somewhere beyond this horizon, evil still lurked. And it was up to her and Owen to defeat it. As the sun climbed overhead, its rays beat down on Daisy's neck, sapping her energy. But she hardly noticed the discomfort, so focused was she on moving steadily forward. No matter what perils lay ahead, she could not stop. Too many relied on her completing this quest. When the glaring daylight made her eyes ache and head pound, Daisy retreated under a crude palm leaf canopy they had fashioned over part of the raft. Owen smiled encouragingly at her as he kept steering them along. Daisy was thankful as always for the boy's presence and perseverance. Late afternoon brought welcome relief in the form of a rain shower. Daisy spread her arms wide, embracing the cool water falling from heaven. Owen laughed and did the same. For a moment, they forgot their troubles, splashing joyfully on the raft like two carefree children. Daisy wished she could hold on to this feeling forever. That night, Daisy and Owen took turns sleeping as the waves rocked them gently onward through the velvety darkness. When it was her watch, Daisy marveled at the glittering carpet of stars stretching endlessly above them. It made their raft seem tiny, yet she took comfort in knowing the same stars watched over their distant home. The next day brought more endless horizon, but also a welcome distraction, a pod of gray dolphins swimming by their raft. Owen clapped delightedly as the sleek animals leaped and chattered around them. Daisy thanked the creatures for bringing such merriment to their journey. She chose to see it as a sign of fortune on their path. By their third day at sea, supplies were dwindling. Daisy tried not to worry Owen, but she secretly began fretting over what they would eat and drink. She was scanning the empty blue waves desperately for any sign of land when suddenly Owen cried out. Daisy spun around, fearing he was hurt. "Ship ahoy!" Owen yelled excitedly, pointing over Daisy's shoulder. She swiveled and glimpsed in the distance the unmistakable outline of a large sailing vessel. Hope swelled in Daisy's chest. Perhaps they would not starve lost at sea after all. Owen waved his shirt excitedly to flag the ship down. With surprising speed, the hulking ship maneuvered alongside their tiny raft. A dozen weathered faces peered down in curiosity at Daisy and Owen. Daisy's heart pounded, wondering if these humans could be trusted. But then a rope ladder unfurled down to them and an older man called for them to come aboard. Having little choice, Daisy clung to Owen as they ascended the swaying ladder onto the ship's polished deck. They were instantly surrounded by sailors who fired questions in a foreign tongue. Daisy shook her head helplessly, not understanding. But the man who had invited them up held his hands out gently, and Daisy allowed herself to exhale. Over the next days, Daisy and Owen were welcomed into the ship's crew like old friends. The captain Abe spoke broken English and told them he had sailed from the north. Daisy explained little of their quest, saying only that they sought a new home, far from evil forces that had overrun their homeland. Abe nodded sagely, his eyes filled with empathy. Under the heat of the afternoon sun, Daisy smiled proudly watching Owen learn knots and fishing with the friendly sailors. Though they had left loved ones behind, she realized she and Owen could still find pockets of light in this world. Each simple moment of joy or beauty was a treasure. Daisy tucked them away carefully in her heart, sustenance for whatever lay ahead. The ship sailed for many days and nights. Sometimes Daisy would gaze at the foam swirling off the bow, knowing they floated ever closer to their final destination, though still so far from all they once cherished. In those moments, her hope wavered. But then she would look to Owen's broad grin as he breathed deep the salty air, and she chose to believe this journey could someday lead them home. Chapter 16. Daisy leaned on the worn wooden rail of the ship, gazing out as their vessel sliced through shimmering turquoise waters. After so many weary days at sea, anticipation thrummed through her. By Abe's reckoning, land was close. Their journey's end was near, but Daisy feared what that could mean for her and Owen. Since boarding this ship, they had enjoyed a welcome respite from the evil pursuing them. But now they neared the shores under Lilith's control. Daisy's hand drifted to the silk pouch hidden under her tunic where she kept the crystal. Its protection would soon be vital once more. Daisy was lost in thought when joyful shouts arose from the crow's nest. A green smudge appeared on the horizon. Owen whooped and pumped his fist, land at last. Daisy managed a smile, ruffling the boy's wind-tousled hair. She wished she still had his innocence, untroubled by the darkness ahead. By midday, a rugged coastline emerged from the azure sea. The sailors prepared to weigh anchor and row Daisy and Owen ashore. As they descended to the waiting dinghy, Abe pressed bundles of bread and dried meat into their arms. Daisy hugged the kind captain tightly. His weathered face was somber, knowing the danger they faced alone. The sailors rowed them towards a secluded beach buffered by steep cliffs. Scrambling from the dinghy onto wet sand, Daisy and Owen stood for a moment gazing back at their friends on the gently rocking ship. Then the sailors turned and rowed away without looking back. They both understood this was a goodbye. Daisy took Owen's hand and together they walked slowly up the beach, shells crunching under their worn boots. She had no real plan, only to follow her instincts once ashore. When they reached grassy clifftops, Daisy paused, sensing this was the right path, though she did not know where it led. With deep breaths, they headed off into the unknown. As the sun dipped lower behind them, the way grew darker and more tangled. They stumbled frequently over gnarled roots and stones. Owen remained stoic, but Daisy's dread amplified. She began to fear she had chosen wrongly until finally, they emerged into a moonlit clearing. In its center rose a monolithic slab of stone etched with mysterious symbols. Daisy and Owen approached cautiously. This place held an energy that raised the fine hairs on Daisy's neck. She reached out to touch the cool surface of the stone and gasped as the carvings began to glow with an unearthly purple light. "It's beautiful," Owen whispered. Both of them stared mesmerized as the glyphs pulsed brighter, bathing the entire clearing in their hypnotic aura. Daisy's fingertips still rested on the stone. Its power called to her, but to do what? She leaned closer, drawn by an irresistible force. Abruptly the purple flare exploded into blinding white light. Daisy and Owen were thrown back by a shock wave. Daisy's head spun as she sat up, blinking away dust. The stone now towered twice as tall, its etchings burning blood red. The air crackled with energy like lightning about to strike. Then a piercing shriek echoed from the dark sky above. Daisy's blood ran cold as a monstrous winged silhouette emerged through the swirling clouds. An enormous dragon with ruby eyes descended, blocking out the moon as it landed atop the stone. It fixed Daisy in its terrible gaze and growled, "You should not have come here, fairy." Daisy yanked Owen behind her, holding up her palms defensively though she trembled head to toe. The dragon snorted, sending sparks flying from its nostrils. Daisy stood frozen. They had stumbled right into a trap with no way out. Chapter 17. Daisy's mind raced wildly, trying to formulate some plan to save herself and Owen from the monstrous dragon looming over them. But she could only clutch Owen tighter as the beast's glowing red eyes bored into them, teeth bared as fiery embers swirled inside its throat. She had led them straight into Lilith's clutches. The dragon took one thundering step towards Daisy and Owen, the ground shaking beneath its massive claws. Daisy's knees went weak with terror, but just as the creature drew back its head to unleash its inferno upon them, a voice rang out. "Halt!" A cloaked figure strode into the clearing, hand raised calmly towards the dragon. To Daisy's shock, the dragon immediately retreated several paces with a snarl, obeying the command. The hooded newcomer turned to Daisy, moonlight illuminating a pale feminine smirk that chilled Daisy's blood. "Lilith. We meet at last, little fairy," Lilith purred, pushing back her hood. "You've caused me quite the inconvenience with your meddling. But no matter, the crystal will soon be mine." She extended a long, pale hand towards Daisy in expectation. Anger momentarily eclipsed Daisy's fear. Never. She spat, clutching the hidden pouch tighter. If Lilith obtained the crystal, all was truly lost. The witch's amber eyes narrowed dangerously at Daisy's defiance. She glanced at the dragon. Persuade our young friend to cooperate, will you? Daisy barely managed to dive away as flames erupted where she'd stood seconds before. Owen cried out, scampering just out of the dragon's reach. Lilith merely watched calmly, making no moves to restrain the beast. Daisy realized with dread the creature meant to force the crystal from her, by any means necessary. Darting behind the burning stone slab, Daisy's mind whirled. Her power was nothing compared to the ancient dragon, but she had to try something. As the dragon's giant maw lunged for her again, Daisy reached deep within herself to draw out magic she never knew she possessed. To her utter shock, Daisy's palms emitted a dazzling pulse that hit the dragon squarely in its chest. The beast whimpered in pain, recoiling backwards. Lilith's smug expression faltered, while Owen whooped triumphantly. But Daisy knew her attack could only slow the dragon. Their only chance was to somehow destroy Lilith herself. Thinking on her feet, Daisy grabbed a smoldering branch blown from the dragon's flames. As the beast recovered, she hurled the fiery wood directly at Lilith. The witch screeched, batting at her burning cloak. As Lilith became distracted, Daisy yelled to Owen. The stone. Help me topple it. Owen instantly understood Daisy's desperate plan. Together they threw their weight against the massive slab. It teetered slowly as Lilith shrieked for her dragon's aid. With heaving breaths, Daisy and Owen pushed harder. Finally, the stone groaned and tipped off its base, crashing down onto Lilith and her tangled cloak. The witch's wails were silenced under pulverizing weight. The crippled dragon looked stunned that its mistress had been crushed. Seeing their chance, Daisy helped a limping Owen onto the beast's spiny back while it was still dazed with shock and pain. She then climbed up herself and faced the creature's writhing head. You will take us home now, dragon. Daisy commanded with as much courage as she could feign. The dragon grunted, but seemed to assent. It unfurled its enormous wings with a snap, sailing them into moonlit clouds above the silent forest and the rubble that entombed Lilith at last. Chapter 18. Daisy clung to the dragon's spiny back as it soared through the night sky, wind whipping her hair wildly. Her heart still hammered from the confrontation with Lilith. She could hardly believe their desperate gamble had succeeded. But the witch was vanquished, and now they soared through moonlit clouds back towards home at last. Beside Daisy, Owen let out an exhilarated whoop into the cold air as he took in the incredible view from this height. Daisy managed a shaky laugh. Owen's courage never ceased to amaze her. She drew strength from his energy now for whatever they would face upon reaching their long-lost home. As the eastern sky began to pale, Daisy recognized forests and valleys unfolding beneath them. Her breath caught realizing how close they were. But smoke rising in the distance soon dashed her hopes. As they cleared a craggy peak, the devastation came into view. Daisy clutched her heart at the sight of her beloved fairy village reduced to scorched rubble. All that remained of the mushroom cottages were a few charred stakes jutting from the earth. Daisy's eyes flooded with tears. Was there any home left to save? Had evil won after all? The dragon circled lower, jostling Daisy from her anguished thoughts. Owen pointed excitedly towards a small group emerging from the edge of the woods. Daisy gasped, realizing they were a band of battered and bedraggled fairies. One with emerald wings looked up and shouted in disbelief and elation. As soon as they landed, Daisy found herself encircled by her people, weeping and laughing as they embraced her. She saw familiar faces from her childhood like her dear friend Iris, who had helped lead the refugees into hiding after the initial attack. Daisy was overwhelmed that some had survived Lilith's cruelty. Once the initial shock subsided, Daisy was peppered with questions about her quest. Her people were stunned to learn of the evil witch's demise. Daisy in turn learned that the remaining fairies had been staging small raids against the human poachers, still occupying portions of the forest, waiting for her return. Daisy knew Lilith's death did not mean their struggle was over. But with the crystal's power and her people's resilience, she felt a renewed flush of hope and determination. They would take back their home and rebuild what was lost. Daisy raised the gem high as she rallied her people. The crystal's light filled them with courage for the fight ahead. In the days that followed, Daisy led sorties deep into the woods to harry and misdirect the bands of humans still loyal to Lilith. Owen used his knowledge of human weaknesses from his past to help the fairies gain every possible advantage. Together, they rescued kidnapped fairies and recovered lost lands section by section. At long last, the day came when the remaining enemy camps were uprooted and driven out for good by an overwhelming force of fairies. As Daisy watched the invaders flee into the hills, she threw an arm around Owen, overcome with exhausted relief, though wounds remained. Physically and spiritually, the forest belonged wholly to its people once more. That night, Daisy walked alone to the ruins of her mushroom cottage. Sifting through the ashes, she uncovered a tiny shimmering object, the foxglove flower mirror from her vanity, somehow preserved. Daisy gazed at her soot-streaked face reflected in the glass and let flow the tears she had restrained for so long. All was not as it was, but there was hope. As Daisy watched the stars turn overhead, contemplating the winding road fate had led her down, she felt a small hand take hers. Looking down, she saw one of the orphaned fairy children, his eyes full of trust and comfort. "Let's go home," the boy said softly. Daisy smiled through her tears. Home was no longer a place, it was the people beside you. And hers still remained, however battered. Home was hope. Chapter 19. In the weeks after reclaiming the fairy forest, Daisy devoted herself fully to the monumental tasks of rebuilding and restoring a sense of home. She toiled from dawn till dusk alongside her people, clearing rubble, erecting new mushroom cottages, and planting gardens. The work left her muscles weary but her heart full. Owen seemed to have boundless energy as he pitched in everywhere he could. He entertained the fairy children with games and songs to lift their spirits after the horror of Lilith's invasion. Seeing Owen embraced as one of their own filled Daisy with immense happiness. She realized this hodgepodge family, born of tragedy, was more precious to her than ever. In time, the mushroom homes regrew in circles around the mighty oak trees and carpets of flowers returned to the forest floor. The fairies were cautious at first to revel in their restored sanctuary, the darkness of recent memory still too near. But soon, smiles and laughter rang out again between the ancient trees. One sunny afternoon, Daisy returned from gathering acorns to find the village in the midst of jubilant preparations. Her dear friend Iris grabbed Daisy's wrist, explaining today was the start of the annual Feast of Flora, the great celebration of nature's renewal. Daisy's heart swelled realizing that her people had regained enough hope to uphold their cherished traditions. That night, under the glow of ethereal will-o'-the-wisps, the fairies danced around the maypole garlanded with flowers. For the first time since her quest began, Daisy allowed herself to get lost in music and merriment, the bittersweet taste of survival mingling with joy on her tongue. A bright new era lay ahead. As spring gave way to golden summer, Daisy found her thoughts returning more and more to her journey beyond the forest. She often wandered down to the brook, remembering the day she had fatefully chosen to leave home in pursuit of adventure. It seemed a lifetime ago now. On one such day, Daisy was startled from her reverie by footsteps behind her. Nyx. He had returned safely from his own sojourn. The old gnome chuckled at Daisy's exclamation of surprise and delight. She leapt up to embrace her dearest friend, bombarding him with questions. That night, Nyx regaled Daisy and the enraptured children with tales of his travels into the lands once under Lilith's shadow. With the crystal's power, her foul magic had been lifted, allowing light and hope to spread once more. Daisy's heart swelled with pride at the part she and Owen played in this triumph. In Nyx's gentle eyes, Daisy glimpsed the infinite days ahead and all the good she could still accomplish for her people and the realms beyond. Since childhood, her dreams had pulled her in every direction: adventure, destiny, freedom. Now, she felt anchored but not trapped, content in the present but still excited for the future. Daisy had found her true home was wherever hope led. The coming weeks passed swiftly in a blur of hard work and community joy. Daisy was amazed one evening to realize the summer solstice celebration was just a fortnight away. She grinned sneakily to herself, knowing exactly what treat she would prepare for Owen and the others, as she had each year since she was a girl, her famous mixed berry pie. Daisy hurried to the market stalls to gather ingredients. Though darkness had passed, Daisy knew life would never be quite the same. But she chose to focus on the gifts, a rekindled spirit of togetherness, a richer understanding of life's balance, and a family woven together by the strength of shared experience. She danced happily through the sunlight-dappled trees, at peace but also open-hearted, onward to whatever came next. Chapter 20. Daisy awoke before dawn on the summer solstice, too excited to sleep. Today was the grand feast celebrating the sun's long-awaited return. It was her favorite day of the year, filled with delicious food, music, and merriment amongst loved ones. Daisy dressed quickly, wings fluttering in anticipation. Skipping down the forest path strewn with wildflowers, Daisy breathed deeply of the honeysuckle-scented air. Everywhere fairies darted to and fro, making final preparations for the grand tonight. The tantalizing smells of berries and baked goods drifted from nearby cottages. Reaching the village square, Daisy gasped in delight. Towering oak trees were festooned with thousands of glowing lanterns and silken banners in every color. Wreaths of herbs and flowers decorated each doorway. Long picnic tables laden with platters of food lined the area. Musicians tuned their lutes and harps, ready to perform. Daisy made her way through the eye-popping splendor to her own cottage. Pulling her legendary mixed berry pie from the windowsill, she inhaled its medley of juicy scents and crimped the golden pastry edges just so. Perfect! Daisy carefully set the pie on a plate and hurried to join the revelries. As the sun sank, fairies flooded the square dressed in their finest satin and lace gowns. Daisy laughed merrily as Owen spun her about the maypole while lanterns cast a dreamy glow. Under the boughs strung with flowers, the war and heartache felt lifetimes away. At long last, the feasting commenced. Daisy heaped her plate high with roasted vegetables, fresh bread with churned butter, cheeses, and honey-glazed venison. The meal tasted all the sweeter shared with those once feared lost. Stuffing themselves, trading stories, the revelers forgot past darkness and looked only towards the sun-bright days ahead. As Daisy savored her last mouthfuls, the villagers clamored for her famous pie. Beaming ear to ear, she presented the dessert to raucous applause. The berry's tart sweetness melted over Daisy's tongue, recalling all the years she had baked this special treat. Though much had changed, this tradition, like the berries in springtime, now rooted her. Overwhelmed with emotion, Daisy raised her glass in a toast. She thanked every hero, past and present, named or unknown, who carried hope through the darkness to see them here today. As Daisy looked into the faces of her drinking, smiling, laughing friends, she glimpsed the future, one story amongst many, twined together in quiet beauty. Much later, Daisy lay on her back gazing up at the sea of glimmering stars. Somewhere out there, new stories were unfolding even now. Her own journey was far from over. But tonight had woven her a little tighter into the rich tapestry called home. For now, that was more than enough magic for one happily tired fairy. With a smile on her face, Daisy closed her eyes and dreamed of adventures yet to come.